Hi, welcome. Good evening. Great to have everybody here tonight. I hope we're opening some great Rieslings. You might also consider a Pinot Blanc, a Pinot Gris, a Pinot Noir, any of the Burgundian grape varieties from either of the regions that we're discussing tonight, which are the Nahe and the Rheinhessen. So we're on the third of our Germany Spotlight series. And the first two focused on individual regions or Weinbaugebiete, which were the Rheingau and the Mosel. Those are the two most prestigious regions where you find a lot of the not distributors, but winemakers that you would find here in the United States, and a lot of the renowned. Those are the regions that really people are familiar with for German wine. And we're going to delve into two more up and coming regions today. So the Mosel and the Rheingau have a huge long history established for premium and quality viticulture and for high quality wine. And the Nahe and the Rheinhessen are more modern wine regions. There is some history here. Don't let me not get into that because we will, you know it. But in terms of the kind of modern viability in the global wine market, they're focused on quality as far as we know it in the past several decades or even more 50 years or so, had really increased in quality in these past 10 or 20 years. So there are two really exciting regions to discuss. Because they're not the Mosel or the Rheingau, there's a lot less information on these regions. But I think one of the great things about learning about wine, as we always say, is the opportunity to be able to learn about these places, to find better value, to follow up and coming producers, and to get the opportunity to explore terroir. And we're going to talk today about a little bit of the changes within the German wine law that really will allow us to focus on learning more about how the individual terroir does affect mostly Riesling. It's the main grape we're talking about. We're still primarily focused on Riesling in both of these regions. But how the terroir can really affect that single grape variety, and how, if you're interested and curious in learning about how terroir and aspect and soil type shapes a single grape variety and the resulting wine from that grape, from that site, you can do that with Riesling at a much better price to you than you can with, let's say, Pinot Noir from anywhere in the world, but especially Burgundy or Chardonnay as well. So I think it's a really fun opportunity to do this today. You might have some wines that we purchased coming from Ledoux's, our great partners that have been shipping wine for us out of the West Village. You have two of the best today. You have the Grunderloch, the Niersteiner Dry Trocken Riesling, and then you have a Spätlese coming from Donhoff. And Donhoff is really a producer that primarily focuses on dry wines, but will go to the Predicat system when the year does permit it. So it's really kind of special to have a Spätlese wine. They used to label their wines with the Cabernet Trocken, Spätlese Trocken, but they are a VDP member. So that conjunctive labeling is not allowed by the VDP. If you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about, who is Donhoff, who is Gunderlach, who is the VDP, and what is Cabernet, don't worry, we're going to get into all of that. So just a general overview, let's start with Germany as a whole. The main cluster of Weinbaugebiete, of which there are 13 total, are clustered in the sort of southwestern part of Germany, better for viticulture. You have a couple of outliers over here, Saale-Unstrut and Sachsen, which we'll be covering in next week's class. And today we're primarily focusing on the Nahe and the Rheinhessen. Now this map is, it's a little skewed in size. It's a good basic map to understand where the wine regions are in relation to each other in Germany, but the sizing it's not to scale. Let's just say that. So let's just spotlight in a little bit and start to look at sort of an overview. These are the great maps that we get from Fernando Beteta, who's a master of wine. You should check out his site. Maybe I'll put a link to that tomorrow when I send out the follow-up materials. But he does some really great wine maps with Google Earth. So we can really see how far these regions are from each other, the relative size of these areas, as well as the topography too, because anytime we talk about a wine region, we really want to understand the topography, because the topography has a lot to do with the climate, the terroir, right? The aspect, the grape varieties that we might plant depending on where we are climatically within a country or a continent, right? But it also tells us about the major geographical features. And a lot of times we talk about rivers as it pertains to the Roman planting vines, because these rivers were really the avenues of commerce, right? That they used to move themselves and the goods that they traded around continental Europe during the age of Roman expansion. So you can just sort of quickly look at some of the sizes here. You can tell that the Rheinhessen, the previous photo showed the Rheinhessen and the Nahe as being the same size. That's just simply not true. The Rheinhessen is large. It actually has the most land under vine of any region. Even if Baden and Württemberg look larger, there's more grape planted here in the Rheinhessen than anywhere else. By comparison, you can see how small the Mosel and the Rheingau are, which are the two top regions for prestigious wine that we discussed in the last two episodes in Germany as well. So today we'll talk about the Nahe, the Rheinhessen. We'll filter in some information about some of the other regions as it's needed, especially as it pertains to the history of Germany as a whole, which we will cover. As you can see, and today we're talking about the history. We're going to do a brief overview of German history. A lot of this pertains to the Mosel and the Rheingau. As I would putting the history together for this class, because we're talking about two separate regions, I was going to redo the entire first slide for history, and I just only changed a few things. I left most of the things about the Mosel and the Rheingau in there, so we have a context of what's happening in Germany during these times. And I included the pertinent information in each of the slides about the Nahe and the Rheinhessen. So we'll talk about geography and climate, the wine quality system. I really enjoy talking about the quality system, because I think that learning a few things about reading a label and understanding the quality system and how wines are classified in an individual country really helps us as consumers to find, again, better value, but also to understand the quality and the character of the wine that we might expect in the bottle by what on the label, by the words that are written on the label, by the region, by the grape variety, etc. And then the other thing is that the quality and system in Germany is evolving. And we talked about this in the first class. I'm not sure if Ryan was able to touch on it in the Mosel class, but we'll do a quick overview of that before. If anybody did not catch the Mosel or the Rheingau class, where we went into more detail about the new and escalating wine law, please just send me an email and I'll be able to get those recordings to you. So the quality system, the major villages and vineyards. So this is going to be really cool, I think, listing some of these major sites that have really been important for centuries, but have just recently in the past several decades come to prominence again. And they're really fantastic sites, and we'll see the difference in soil types and aspect that we do have as well. And we're going to have a heavy focus on producers today as well. The reason for that is because the Nahe is less known for a wine region than the Rheinhessen. And the Rheinhessen, being one of the largest producers in Germany, has a ton of producers. So how do we shift through some of those more mediocre, large estates in this region and focus on the high quality producers? So a really heavy focus on producers today. What I don't want to do is just read off these slides at you, but they are pretty dense. So, always please let me know if you have questions, and I'll just try to keep it moving and keep it fun and light. The point of these slides, when they tend to be a little bit more in depth, if anybody is a native German speaker, I apologize in advance for my accent. I'll do the best that I can and my pronunciation. So right here, we're looking at a picture. This is taken from the slope of the Rheingau. So essentially the vineyard that you see here, that would be, I took this photo at my feet here. I'm standing in the vineyard of the Rheingau. I think this is, maybe it's in the Roseneck vineyard. And you're looking out at the Nahe River right here. On the left-hand side and the right-hand side, we have the village of Bingen. And on the right-hand side over here, you have the Nahe. And on the left-hand side, you have the Rheinhessen. So there's really this tri-point of these three Weinbaugebiete or wine growing regions that come to a head right here. The Nahe flows into the Rhine River. Sorry, I'm having like a little tongue twister today. I just flew back from LA today, so we're having a great time as always. So just a quick brief overview and reminder of the history. Like many of the wine growing regions in Europe, the Romans had a huge influence here when it came to bringing the vine and planting it throughout the country. By the 3rd century, viticulture was established in the Mosel. It's the earliest evidence of viticulture that we do have in Germany. The Romans also introduced the vine to the Rheingau as well. The monastic era between the 500 and 1500, sort of the darker, the Middle Ages, right? They really helped develop a lot of the vineyards during this time. They built churches. Wine was just really important during this time for many reasons. We oftentimes credit these monastic orders and the church, but it was also, in general, it was important not just to religion, but also to the general populace. You know, wine was an important source of calories during this time for a lot of people. It was also an important source of hygienic beverage because it was already something that had been fermented as well. But the church really did help develop and name a lot of these vineyards, and wine growing during this time really came to dominate these smaller regions, unmatched anywhere else in Germany. We see a lot of the castles called Schloss, so you'll hear that word a lot, and the abbeys, the cloisters that are developed during this time. In the early 12th century, Benedictine monks founded the cloister at Johannesburg. This is really one of the most important moments in the history of German wine. And we won't go into it because we're not talking about the Rheingau today, but again, let me know if you have questions about that. In 1136, the Cistercians arrived from Burgundy. They were a monastic order that were renowned for their farming aptitude for all types of crops, but also including grapevines, and they established Kloster Eberbach. They were probably the ones who brought Pinot Noir and planted it during this time. And if you're not familiar, Pinot Noir is the most important red grape to Germany as well. We see a lot of castles that are established during this time from the aristocrats who secure a lot of massive land and vineyard holdings. Monks record the cultivation of Riesling at Kloster Eberbach by 1435. Schloss Schönborn and Schloss Johannesburg are among the first producers in Germany to introduce glass bottles in the early 1700s. And this was earlier than a lot of other places within the world, or within Europe, I should say, excuse me, were bottling their production in glass. A lot of people were still shipping it to the market that it was going to in barrels or some sort of, amphora or something like that for it to be bottled at that area that it was being sold. Kloster Eberbach began making high quality wines as Cabernet in 1712. Cabernet we typically see on label today as Kabinett. Essentially, they noted that some wines from particular sites were high quality enough to keep in the cabinet and to age. And this is important to keep in mind because we oftentimes think of Riesling as being light, fresh, fruity wine, but it really has an incredible amount of ageability to it. And I think too, especially thinking about the Nahe and the Rheinhessen today, if you are new to drinking Riesling, I wouldn't necessarily recommend trying one of the more aged styles. As Riesling does age, it takes on more minerality. Always has a lot of acidity to it. And the acidity itself can tame a little bit as the wine ages, but the fruit also drops away, which increases that perception of minerality and that perception of a petrol that you sometimes tend to get in Riesling as well. So just keep that in mind. If you're new to Riesling, usually people want to experience more of the kind of fresh and fruity side of Riesling, as opposed to the austere aged and more savory side that you might see. And Schloss Johannesburg in 1775 announced the first planned spätlese harvest of botrytis-affected fruit. The Archbishop of Trier, Wenceslaus, decreed a mandatory shift to Riesling in the region in 1786. Trier is located again in the Mosel. Napoleon defeats Germany and annexes all land west of the Rhine River. This includes the Nahe and includes the Rheinhessen, which we'll talk about as well. In 1803, all the church-owned vineyards are secularized, and the Napoleonic Code fragments the vineyard holdings. So this did not just take place in France, but also in Germany. But in the 1800s, we really see this golden era of German Rieslings. They command top dollar. The height of German fame really rests on the Rheingau during this time. However, I don't have it here in this slide, but in 1912, when the Titanic sunk, the most expensive bottle of wine on the Titanic was a bottle of Riesling, coming from actually the Rheinhessen. So keep that in mind too. In 1910, we see the formation of what would eventually become the VDP, which we'll discuss. But in the 1900s, we have a lot of very cold vintages, a lot of issues in Germany with phylloxera. Of course, there's been a lot of war, and we're not just talking about the World Wars, but the 30-year wars and other things like that were fought leading up to that time. And we see a rise of crossings. And crossings are when we take two different species of grape varieties, like Vitis vinifera, which is the fine wine European grape that we know to make most of the best wines. We would think, I mean, most of the grapes that you would name would be Vitis vinifera, Riesling, Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, all of these, right? And then we take another species of grape variety and we make a crossing. And these crossings are typically created to be hardy to cold, to be hardy against maybe certain types of diseases or mold, different things that might be affecting the vineyard. So they tend to focus more on quantity and less on actual quality. But some of these crossings can be really fun as well. So we'll keep, especially when they're done at these really low yields. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those also. Liebfraumilch, let's go back, sorry. In 1971, German wine law seek to reorganize and condense an existing 30,000 vineyard site to 2,600. And it codifies the must wait, which is the sugar at the harvest within the juice before we begin the fermentation, as the hierarchy of quality within Germany. Liebfraumilch becomes the biggest export. There's a lot of mass market confusion over German labeling and wine styles. In 2002 and 2012, the VDP, going back there again, began a series of vineyard classification. So they started it in 2002. They updated it in 2012. And this was an attempt to better organize and codify a lot of the sites that we see on labels of wine that tell us where these grapes came from. And keep this in mind, because in Germany, traditionally, we have not classified the actual vineyard site that they come from. You can put a vineyard site on a bottle of wine, and you would have to know as a consumer what the quality or the prestige of that vineyard was, because there was not really any other information on the label that would tell you about the classification of that particular site, right? Today, we see an energy of a ton of new producers. In the Nahe, we have Helmut Donhoff. His son is taking over today. We have Armin Diehl, Werner Schonleber. In the Rheinhessen, we have Klaus-Peter Keller, Fritz Hasselbach. His son has taken over Johannes today, Philip Whitman, Carolyn Gillot, and Daniel Wagner, just like Wagner, just like the guy who writes all of the operas, right? So let's talk about the German quality system. So the Prädikat is what most consumers are familiar with when it comes to classifying German wine. The Qualitätswein can come from one of any 13 Anbaugebiete, remember any of these regions. The other words you might see on a label include trocken, which means dry, halbtrocken, which means off dry, and feinherb, which also means off dry. And then a subset of the Qualitätswein is the Prädikatswein. And the Prädikatswein is a quality wine with a designated Prädikat level, labeled with that Prädikat. And usually you would also see a village and a vineyard. Not necessarily always, but typically if you're making wine at this higher quality level at the Prädikat, you're also labeling with a village and a vineyard, but not necessarily always. So the Prädikat is based on the must wait at harvest. So we're talking about the actual sugar level of the grape and of the juice after you press those grapes before the fermentation begins. So the Prädikat system is often considered to be a sweetness system, but that's not necessarily true. The Prädikat itself wasn't necessarily meant to be associated with increasing levels of sweetness, but we have come to associate it that way because it can be associated with increasing levels of sweetness, or it cannot be. So it is a little bit confusing, but essentially the Cabernet is usually the lightest style. These would be your sort of like almost fine herb or halbtrocken styles. Modern day Cabernet is much drier than the Cabernet from 20 or sometimes even 10 years ago. But Cabernet are usually your lightest, freshest styles of wine. Spätlese is a step up. Spätlese will be even riper during the harvest, and you'll have both riper fruit flavors. You'll have more intense fruit and concentration, at least you should have, and possibly a little bit more sugar because of the sweetness of the grapes themselves at the harvest. And then you have the Auslese level, and Auslese can be a little bit sweeter. It can be definitely riper with riper fruit flavors. It might also begin to be affected by what we call botrytis, so a noble rot that grows on the skins of the grape that pierces the skins and sort of dries out the grape on the vine and raisinates it. Now, so these three styles can essentially be dry or sweet, but you should assume that each increasing level from Cabernet to Spätlese to Auslese will be richer in flavor, more concentrated, and riper in flavor, right? So Cabernet, white peach, Auslese, yellow peach, or almost even dried peach, really ripe peach character, right? Now, Bier und Auslese, Trockenbier and Auslese, and Eiswein are always dry. At the Auslese level, we really begin to see picking individual berries, but for Bier und Auslese and Trockenbier and Auslese, you always pick individual berries. Here you have a couple of photos from the message in a bottle, which we'll talk about in the Rheinhessen. They have changed the message in a bottle labeling to something new, the Maxim Herkunft Rheinhessen. And so you can just see a few examples of what you might see on this label from this producer association that's really focused on quality within the Rheinhessen. So another example of what you might see, a deep yellow from riper styles of grape, or a Riesling, a pale straw for your lighter, usually drier styles. And you can see the difference in the grapes. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time on the Prädikat system because a lot of the focus on wines in the Nahe and in the Rheinhessen are drier styles. That doesn't mean that the Prädikat does not exist and producers don't use it, but usually the producer percentage of their production is between like 70 and 95% dry styles of wine. And that's a common trend. One of the things I hear most still is that people think that Riesling is always sweet. And people will even take a drink of a dry Riesling and be like, oh, it's sweet, because you associate all those clouds of pillowy fruit flavor that you get to be sweet, right? Your brain thinks you have something that tastes like fruit. You don't eat underripe fruit. So sometimes you're like, oh, I think it must be sweet, even when it's not. Now, the trend in Germany had been for decades to drink dry styles of Riesling, and we're really catching up in a lot of other places within the world. So, but you can just see an example. These would be your dry, your Cabernet, or your Spätlese wines. So the Spätlese would be more late harvest. Essentially, that's what it means. It means late harvest. Your beer, your Auslese, you can see you're starting to have some botrytized grapes or raisinated riper grapes. Your beer and Auslese are even more botrytized styles of grape, that noble rot that grows on them. And then your Trockenbeer and Auslese is entirely botrytized styles of grape. Now we understand the Prodicot system. So it's a system of quality based on the ripeness of the grapes at harvest. It can result in sweeter styles, but not always. But now we have the VDP. So the VDP is a growers organization that was always dedicated to high quality wine. They started first in 1910 with the concept of nature wines, meaning they didn't want their producers to chaptalize their wine, which was adding sugar during the fermentation, not to increase the sweetness of the wine, but to increase the finished body and alcohol in the finished wine. So that sugar that they would add would be fermented into final alcohol. Well, the VDP doesn't want that. They want you to select the best sites to grow your grapes, particularly Riesling, even though each of the 13 Weinbaugebiete can select which grape varieties they use for the VDP for their top wine. So for example, the Rheingau can use Riesling and Pinot Noir, but somewhere like the Pfalz also includes like Pinot Blanc for their VDP wines. So just to keep that in mind. So they really wanted to focus on the vineyard site and the notion of terroir. They wanted to focus on lower yield and better quality in the vineyard so that you could make good styles of wine that had enough richness and alcohol without needing to add sugar during the fermentation, without chaptalizing the wine. So it's widely accepted, and there's many members that, you know, some people come join and leave the VDP, but it usually hovers right around 200 today. It's not technically approved by German wine law, but we're about to talk about how German wine law has incorporated a lot of the tenets of the VDP. So the concept of the VDP, and you can see here, this is what you'll see on a bottle of wine if a producer belongs to this organization. This is the Traubenadler, so the eagle with the crest of grapes. And they adhere to a system of labeling their wines according to regional wine, village wine, and then essentially Premier Cru and Grand Cru wine. So the concept of the VDP is based on the model of Burgundy. If you're familiar with that, regional wine, you can label it with the village, or you can label it with essentially what we would call a Premier Cru, which is the Erstlage, or a Grand Cru, which is the Grosslage. Unfortunately, this is also a little bit unwieldy, which happens often with German wines because you want to compare it to Burgundy, but there are 33 Grand Crus in Burgundy, but there are something like 400 Grosslage throughout Germany. So we're also talking about a country versus a region, right? Now, Grossgewach that you see here are great growths, and these are always dry style of wine. So Grossgewachs always come from a Grosslage. This is your kind of Grand Cru style of vineyard, right? But they're always dry. So Grosslage can be sweet or dry. Grossgewachs coming from a Grosslage always have to be dry. They're also always at the Spätlese level of ripeness when the grapes are picked. So you know that you'll have a more powerful, more intense, complex fruit style of wine, but with a dry finish. And in Germany, that dry finish means, is it balanced, right? Because you can have up to 9 grams per liter of residual sugar, which is not considered dry by the standards of most other countries. But Riesling has such high acidity, if the acidity with the total acidity is within 2 grams of the leftover residual sugar, you can essentially call it a dry wine. Oftentimes in Germany, the model, the formula is 1-to-1. So, you know, the residual sugar to total acidity, 1-to-1. So if it's 5 grams of total acidity, it's 5 grams of residual sugar. That's a pretty common formula for these particular wines. So post 2012, this is the highest vineyard designation, the Grosslage, right? Remember, Grossgewachs is a Grosslage style that's dry. mimic the Grand Cru of Burgundy, Earthlage next in line as the premier cru designation. Probably a lot of the Grosslage should have been classified as Earthlage to make the classification more like Burgundy and more understandable, because there's actually more Grosslage than there are Earthlage, more Grand Crus than Premier Crus. The Ortwein, this is your village level wine, so you could label it as Rudesheim, or we could say Nierstein is what we should actually be saying for somewhere like the Rheinhessen, or the Gutwein, which would be labeled as Rheinhessen or the Nahe. So 2021, we wanted to try to integrate the actual wine law of Germany, which is the Prädikat system, with the tenets that were set by the VDP. So this slide is really to try to help bring everything that I was just saying about these two separate entities together, right? So we understand that most countries classify wine according to the source, the actual vineyard source, the land source of the grapes. We know that Germany's historic system uses the sugar levels at harvest, the ripeness, as their criterion for classification. But since we have this really recent focus on dry wines in the past decade or 2 decades, the Prädikat wines are no longer as important as they used to be. And this is also true with global warming, when ensuring ripe grapes is not as difficult. The Prädikat system was sort of born out of the concept that we have this very cold climate where we need to ensure that the grapes that we're picking and making wine from have reached a certain level of sugar, of ripeness at harvest, right? So the Prädikat system kind of rewarded the grower who ensured that their grapes were ripe enough. So while it's not as important or useful as it used to be, it still need to be there to understand the history of wine production in Germany, and also to classify those wines that might have an increasing level of sweetness to them possibly. But it, kind of reaching ripeness is not any longer the all-important factor. And the Prädikat is a contrast of every other system of quality within the European Union. Austria has something similar. They also have a classification based on must weight or sugar at harvest. But any other European countries, you can only produce quality and classified wine from a named parcel of land, right? A specific vineyard that we've recognized over time to be of the highest quality. So for the past 50 years, the system of geographical classification had been based on the 1971 wine law, which we saw introduce the Prädikat system. And it's designed to indicate the source without any implication of quality of the actual vineyard site, right? Because the quality was always defined by the Prädikat, not by the actual vineyard site that the grapes come from. So we're trying to essentially merge these two things. And if you've looked at any of the Prädikat wines from 2021 or before, you have usually a village and a vineyard name. And that in itself is typically should be a earmark of higher quality, because you know that the grapes are coming from a smaller region, a more uniform site, most likely, hopefully, right? So you know that when you see a village, an increasing number of pieces of information on a label, usually the quality does increase, but these sites themselves weren't actually classified. So other than, as I mentioned earlier, other than us knowing as a consumer that the Dr. Vineyard is one of the best, or that Pettenthal is an Ortsteil in Nierstein within the Rheinhessen, without knowing that, we have no indication of the quality of that plot of land on the bottle as a consumer who goes and maybe sees a new vineyard they've never heard of before. And how do you know how that vineyard itself is actually classified, right? And that was one of the issues with the 1971 wine law, that they decided to congregate all of these sites into many, many fewer sites. Remember, 30,000 to 2,600, was to sort of simplify some of this language and make it so that we weren't just putting willy-nilly any plot of land that we wanted to on a label itself. So this new system will exist in parallel with the Pradicot system for quality. It is not technically the VDP system, but it's very, very similar. Also based on geography. So you'll have your Deutscher wine, wine without a geographical indication, can come from anywhere. Within Germany, you have Landwein from a few larger regions. You have any of your 13 Weinbaugebiete you can put on the label. Again, Mosel, Rheinhessen, Nahe, Rheingau, right? You have the Gemeinde. These are the village wines. Einzellagen, which are a single vineyard that you can also put on the label. The Erstgewachs, the Großgewachs. And on a Großgewach or an Erstgewach, you can also put a Gavan, which is a kind of single parcel or liud, much like you see in Burgundy, where some of the Grand Crus can actually be broken down into smaller parcels within that Grand Cru. And this system is going to be mandatory for all German wine by 2026 as well. And I'll send out these slides, so you'll have and some information on that. All right, let's start talking about some of these regions. Let's get going here, right? So viticulture in the Nahe also has the Roman origin. The documentation starts in the 8th century when the abbeys in Lorsch and Fulda recorded donations of vineyards coming from the area. An ordinance from 1594 prohibited the planting of vineyards on land that could be used for edible crops. So this sees the vineyard, the vines being planted higher up on the slopes, the more weathered soils, infertile soils, which is much better for vines as well. 1669 marked the first mention of Riesling in the Nahe. A contract ordered the planting of 200 Riesling vines each year to restore the war-damaged vineyards near Berg Leon. And these vineyards were damaged from the 30-year war. In 1688, the clearing of 2 hillsides near Lengen-Lonsheim was permitted on the condition that only Riesling be planted. But this sounds like we're really focusing on Riesling, but this was an exception. A lot of the vineyards were fieldland based on Elbling and other more reliable varieties, even during this time. In 1794, the region was occupied by the French until Napoleon's defeat and the division of its territory during the Vienna Congress in 1815, when the region became German again. So it's not only Alsace in France that went from France to German to France to German to France. Also, these areas that were west of the Rhine River also went from German to French to German as well. You don't hear about the flip side of it as often. In 2002, when the Großgewachs category was created by the VDP, this really helped the Nahe turn a corner because it really brought a renewed focus to the top sites of this region. And we'll talk about that when we really start discussing the producers in the area. So the region lies between the Mosel and the Rheingau. We saw that photo earlier. With a valley along the river. And then you have these sub-valleys and tributaries that just filter off of the main valley and the main river. So you have the Grafenbach, the Trollbach streams. A lot of wineries are found and vineyards are found along the Trollbach and the southern Glan and Alsace river valleys. It's a much more rolling landscape of vineyards, orchards, meadows, and farms. The Nahe is not as it's not as dependent on the grapevine as places like the Mosel and the Rheinhessen as well. Now, the 1970 wine law kind of saved the Nahe because prior to that, the wines were simply sold as regional Rhine wine. They didn't have their own designation. And there was an MW, and she said that defining the Nahe region might have been the most positive thing to actually come out of the 1971 German wine law altogether. Today, it's a region of revival and newcomers. A lot of leading estates of the post-Second World War era actually no longer exist. Frank Schoonmaker, who wrote a book in the 1950s on German wine, he listed 7 top Weingüter wineries of the Nahe during that time, and only 1 still remains today. So it's really a region that it focused primarily on these really up and coming wineries, even when some of these families have been here for generations and even centuries, like when we talk about Donhof. It is a rising star, even though it's a modern German wine region. There's a huge variation in terroir here, a huge. It's really difficult to classify the Nahe or the Rheinhessen as kind of a single style. Like we talk about the styles of the Mosel and the Rheingau, but it's really hard to pigeonhole either of these regions. It's easier to do with the Nahe. They tend to make wines that are somewhere in between the Rheingau and the Mosel style. They oftentimes have a lot of the purity, the acidity. They have this, the producer described it as laser acidity wrapped in cloud-like fruit to the wine. These can be really fantastic wines in their youth to introduce to new drinkers of Riesling. As they get older, they will become a little bit more austere, very mineral, and sometimes even on the herbal side, which is one of my favorite things about aged Riesling. It's a slight kind of mint character that you sometimes begin to get in the wine. Now, that variation in terroir is reflected in variable quality, which is why we're going to talk so much about the producers in a few moments. And it's surrounded by forests, so it really helps shelter the region. They have all different colors of slate here. They have a lot more clay in the soil than we see in the Mosel or in the Rheingau as well. And because it is in this transitional zone, and it is protected from wind and weather in the north and the west by all of these forests. We have the Sunwald, the Bingerwald, the Nordpfalzer Bergland, that are all protecting this region. It's mild and dry. They only have 20 inches of annual rainfall, and it's one of Germany's driest wine growing, or is Germany's driest wine growing climate. Now, within the Nahe, there are 3 distinct classic subregions that are known for the quality of their Riesling. And when we don't grow Riesling, we usually think about the Burgundian grape varieties in the Nahe. So again, Pinot Noir for red, and for other whites, we talk about Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris. Now, the Upper Nahe is located in the southern part of the appellation. So we're talking about the Upper Nahe River because it's actually beginning to run north. It's running north here. And when it gets to Bingen, or excuse me, not to Bingen, when it gets to Mainz, it bends and goes west, right? And that's the area that we have as the Rheingau. So that west flowing slope that we see there. So the Upper Nahe is in the south and western part. The river runs about 25 kilometers from the east to the west. And this is the area where in the Nahe, the vineyards are planted on these really dramatic south-facing slopes on the northern bank. So this is not common for most of the region. This area extends from Monsingen to Martenstein at the far western end to Schloss-Bockelheim. This is an area of a slightly cooler climate overall. And again, talking about the 1971 wine law, you will see producers that we'll talk about today who do make wine in the Frühlingsplättchen, but it was expanded from less than 8 hectares prior to 1971 to 64 hectares. So you can imagine what a hit of quality that vineyard took during that time. The Middle Nahe is really well known as one of the best areas, followed the course of the river eastward for 15 kilometers from Schloss Bockelheim to Bad Kreuznach. It flows by the villages that we'll talk about today: Oberhausen, Niederhausen, Nordheim, the Rottenfeld Cliff, which is one of the largest cliffs that we see, that's like sheer rock wall, the porphyry, this sort of iron-rich igneous rock cliff that we see within the area. Treisen, and then turns sharply northward at Bad Münster am Stein. This is known as a spa town. Bad essentially means bath, so there's a lot of natural baths and spas within the area. In the Middle Nahe, this region is the most famous for the wine growing villages. The ones that I just mentioned, there are multiple Großlage sites here. Bad Kreuznach is the Nahe's largest town, and it's really the commercial center of the region's wine trade as well. Near Bad Kreuznach, the river turns to run north through the lower Nahe, which is the more upper part, if we're looking at it on a map, until it joins the Rhine, where we saw coming out, hitting the Rhine River just across from Rüdesheim, and right out between the village of Bingen as well. So the main valley is a little bit warmer than the side valleys that run from it. We know this to be true in places like the Mosel as well. The lower Nahe between Bingen and Bad Kreuznach sees more influence from the Rhine. North of Bad Kreuznach, the soil composition becomes heavier. We have more clay and less. The as I mentioned, that tri-point that we see right at Rheinhessen, the right at Rüdesheim, Rheinhessen, Rheingau, and the Nahe Weinbaugebiete. What else can I tell you? So the Riesling from the lower Nahe will be more fuller bodied. They'll have the slightly more opulent style of its neighbor, of the Rheinhessen, and also the style of the Rheingau as well. This is the best area within the Nahe for Spätburgunder or Pinot Noir also. And then from the village of Lobenheim and north, the soils shift, and you see this more slate and quartzite that's common across the Rhine as well in the Rheingau. Dorsheim, Munster, Sarmsheim, Laubenheim are the most renowned wine-growing villages, and Schlossgut at Bergleyen is the most important winery within the Lower Nahe, which we'll talk about. Again, a huge diversity of soils here too. So the middle Nahe, as we mentioned, this is where you see the most of your Grosslagen or Grosslager. Grosslagen is multiple, right? They tend to be on weathered volcanic soils. You also see a lot of slate, limestone, and schist. A lot of these sites were recognized and classified in 1901, as early as 1901, in a map depicting the vineyard area of Koblenz. Like many places, they were probably named for tax purposes, right? Somebody said, hey, you guys are growing something that you're making wine from and selling, like we want to tax that. So in Niederhauser, Hermannshöhle, Grosslager, and Schloss Bockelheim, you have Kupfergrube, which is right over here as well. Here you have Hermannshöhle. Oberhauser Bruck is a monopole of Donhof, but we'll talk about. In Treiser, we have Bastei as well. And then we also have the Felsenberg, which I remember finding on here earlier, but I'll have to find that for you again. So here we can see Bad Kreuznach here, Bad Munster and Steim. Down here we have the Niederhausen, where we have a lot of those important vineyard sites that we were also discussing as well. So who are the producers we should be thinking about, right? So we have Schlossgut Deal. They're located in Bergleyen, as we mentioned before, the most important producer of the Lower Nahe. The castle was purchased by Peter Deal in 1802, but it was Armin and Monica Deal who brought the estate to its current reputation. Their daughter, who you see in the photo on the right, took over in 2006. And the cellars are located underneath the castle itself. The castle is in a state of slight disrepair, but it's quite visually appealing to you as you're, probably driving up to this region and this winery and seeing this castle that's perched upon this winery. The vineyards are located in the Trollbach Valley. They make wine from the Einzellagen of Pittermanchen, Goldlock, Berg are their top vineyards. They're all located within Dorsheim. They're all steep facing sites on the south side of the river, of the Trollbach River, which is a tributary that runs west from the Nahe. Dry wines since the early 80s, they've been producing, and today it's 80% of the production. And you'll see this in a lot of the producers in the Nahe, is that they started with a lot of the sweeter predicate styles of wine. But today, as I mentioned earlier, the primary focus is really on these dry styles. So they have an entry-level range of the Deal to Deal white. They do Riesling, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris for the white, the Rosé de Deal and Noir de Deal are blend of Pinot Noir, and Dornfelder, another important red grape that we'd see less important than Pinot Noir, but the second most important after Pinot Noir in terms of planting and how it's used. They also make Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, and Pinot Noir that are oak aged. They have a couple of cuvées, Victor and Cuvée Caroline, that are in oak as well. And then for the Riesling line, you see a selection of both the regional styles, village level. You have Earfield, which is a vineyard blend. And then for Erstlage, you have the Hohle, Schlossberg, and Krona. And for Grossgewach, what are Grossgewach? These are your dry styles coming from the Grosslagen, the Grand Cru, right? So if you see GG or Grossgewach on the label, you know that it will be a dry style. They also make a traditional range of Predikat sweet style wines. And all of their Rieslings are vinified in 1,300 liter casks that are made from wood and are a minimum of 10 years of age. They also make traditional method sparkling wine, Klassische Flaschengärung. Their most popular is called Mo, named after Monica, 80% Pinot Noir, 20% Chardonnay, and matured 42 months. And they make an entire range of traditional sects. So one thing we haven't really focused on yet in these classes is the importance of sparkling wine in Germany. The German is the top country for drinking sparkling wine of anywhere in the world. They make a lot of sparkling wine, but a lot of bigger, not really quality focused wineries import grapes from other countries and make sparkling wine to sell in Germany. If you see Deutscher Sekt, that means that the grape came from Germany itself, but you really want to usually look for more of the traditional styles of wine, oftentimes coming from things like Riesling or maybe the Burgundian grape varieties. So now we're moving on to Don Hoff. And Helmut says, if it said dry on the label, I mean dry, not half dry. So he's kind of a little bit of a jab at the producers who say their wine are dry, but maybe that dryness is not quite in line with the total acidity there. His grandfather created the estate and began to bottle wine in the 1920s. Helmut's father moved to 100% estate bottling. When he took over in 1966, they had just 4 hectares of vineyards. So Cornelius has taken over fully today since 2016. He joined the estate in 2007. Riesling is 80% of the production, with Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris making up the balance. 70% of the production here is focused on the dry styles of wine. And the vineyards are really spread out here. So you can see kind of a map that Don Hoff has themselves of where their vineyards are located along the river here. And they're really quite spread out. So it takes them more than a month or up to a month to do harvest, even though they're a small estate due to the different microclimate. And when we're talking about the Nahe as well, just the difference between when you would harvest in the upper and lower section could be as much as 2 weeks, which is it's quite a big difference when you're talking about Riesling. Riesling is already the latest ripening grape pretty much in Germany. If you go to Germany and you're working harvest, you're picking your Pinot Noir before your Riesling, which is kind of the reverse of how you would pick your red and your white grape, because Riesling is just such a late ripening grape. You really need all that time on the vine that it can really get. So the wines are aged in a combination of oak, fruiter, neutral, and stainless steel. Their style is really fragrant. It tends to have a lot of floral qualities to it. So you see the Ton Schiefer. This was previously labeled as Cabernet Trocken. Conjunctive labeling with the Prädikat and then listing the Prädikat as a dry style is not permitted by the VDP. So this is a very traditional way of labeling wine. So they're telling you that it was a Cabernet style of ripeness when the grapes were picked, but all of that sugar was fermented. So it's dry and finish in the actual bottle. I find this to be really helpful on a label of German wine, but these are VDP members, Don Hoff, and the VDP does not allow it. I think it's because they want their member to use the Grossgewach labeling, right? The GG labeling, the dry style from Spätlese. So they want that to be the style of wine that they make as a dry style from these top vineyards. So they have several vineyards that are Erstlagen or Premier Cru. They make a full range of the Grossgewach, the dry styles coming from the Grosslage. And these are really dry styles of wine. So when they label them as GG, there's not like a little, sometimes like Benjamin Lewin really says like he's an MW, like a lot of these GG wines still like they're supposed to be dry, but like they have a little tiny bit of sweetness on the finish. The Don Hoff wines, if they say dry, he means dry, not half dry, right? These wines are best to drink before 3 years or after 6 years. They go through a little bit of a dumb phase where you might not necessarily want to have them in that in-between time. And the winery really feels that they're best and they're ready after about 10 years. At the Prädikat level, the Cabernet, the Spätlese, the Auslese, you see a bigger degree of tautness and elegance and precision, along with the purity of fruits. So in the middle Nahe, we have in Niederhausen, Gut Hermenberg. This was previously known as the Niederhausen Schloss Bockelheim, with a state winery founded in 1902. They're very important because they shepherded a lot of the reputations of the Großlagen site of the Middle Nahe through the difficult period of the 20th century. It was privatized in 1998 and first purchased by the Mauer family. Christian Vogt was their first winemaker, and then he went to make wine at a really famous Mosel winery. If you were here for class last week, called Kartauserhof, you would have heard of that. And then it was purchased by Christine Deans and Jen Riedel in 2009, and given its new name. So they took the name Gut Hermannsberg from their top winery, or top, excuse me, it's not winery, vineyard, with the monopole, Gut Hermannsberg. Karsten Peter has been the winemaker since 2009. They've made a lot of investment in the property to bring it back into the modern era. The vineyards run parallel with the Nahe between two mountains, but the influence from the river is pretty small. The climatic influence really comes from the shape of the valley. 93% of what they produce is Riesling, and the rest is Pinot Blanc. So they're just making these two styles of wine. Young vines from the Großlagen go into the estate wine. They call it 7 terroirs. They have many Ortswein. The Ortswein are the village level of wines that you might see. They make 2 Niederhausen village wines from 2, this is pretty cool, from 2 vineyards that are 150 meters apart. Vom Schäfer Trocken comes from the slate vineyard of Hermannsberg. It tends to be more saline and herbal, more mineral, but it has a slightly rounder palate. And Vom Vulcan comes from the volcanic terroir of the Kupfergrube. So it's lighter, it tends to have more tension. And they also make Großgewach wines from each of these Großlagen. So their village wines are coming from the Grand Cru vineyard, but they're declassifying them, right? But they do also because they're from younger vines. The Großgewach, you also make wine for these 2 vineyards as well, these 2 Großlagen, and it's a more intense, like really bolder expression of what you get in the 2 village level wines. So they make a full range of Großgewach wines as well. They all tend to be a little bit different, more delicate or elegant, more intense or smoky or spicy or gunflinty, depending on the soil type of the Großlagen that the wines are coming from. So the Rothenburg, Steinberg, and Felsenberg Großgewach, they released after 1 year. The Bastei from Treisen isn't released until after 2 years, but the Hermannsberg and the Kupfergrube are both released after 5 years. They didn't produce any sweet wine in 2018 to 2020, but they do oftentimes, if the vintage permits it, they will produce a little bit of sweet wine. So we also have Emmerich Schonleber. So also located in the Nahe, this is in Monsingen. It's an older estate. They were engaged in polyculture until Willem and his son Werner turned exclusively to viticulture in the 70s and 80s. Today, also 80% of the production is dry. They employ both stainless steel and fruiters in the wine. All of their vineyards are close by. They're in the immediate area. They have Erstlagen, Großlagen. They make wine, 2 Großgewach wines, one from Frühlingsplatschen. Where do we hear that name before? Again, that vineyard that was expanded from 8 hectares to 64 hectares with the 1971 wine law. They also make wine from the Hagens, Großgewach from the Hagens vineyard in Hallenberg as well. And Ortswein, the village level, they make Mondingen from the younger vines. The R Riesling comes from Hallenberg. And they do a little bit of residual sugar, but it tends to be really well integrated. And they do employ a botrytis in their Auslese wine. So not all producers, like Donhoff really does not like a lot of the flavor of botrytis, and especially now we're getting into the Rheinhessen. Producers like Klaus Peter Keller really don't like the flavor of botrytis or the texture of botrytis in their wine. So they really do very rigorous vineyard selection so that they have ripe grapes, but without the presence of botrytis in most cases. So the Rheinhessen was previously a sea 35 million years ago, an inland sea within the Main basin. They have more tertiary sediments that created most of today's soil. So limestone, sand, marl, clay, loam, gravel. Limestone is very important within the Rheinhessen. They have a good amount that really affects the finished wines and how the grapes taste after they're grown. And these sort of younger soils cover these much older formations that come to the surface at certain points, like the Permian rhyolite on the Röter Hang, which we're going to talk about. The Romans recognized the sunny, dry, fertile conditions with their fortifications in Mainz and Bingen, and the vines here have flourished ever since. The early Middle Ages, Charlemagne established Kaisersalz in Ingelheim, and monastic settlements furthered viticulture within the area as well. Due to its size, Rheinhessen is often described as the largest quality wine producing region in Germany. It is indeed the largest region, but in terms of quality and general interest, it ranks behind the Mosel, the Rheingau, and even the Pfalz, but it does include 25% of Germany's land under vine. So it's a really pretty astronomical amount of wine that they're producing here. You have the Nahe to the west, you have Heißitzschbergstrasse to the east, the Rheingau to the north, and Pfalz to the south. The terrain here is relatively flat. It's a lot more like rolling hills by comparison to the other regions. They're also sheltered by several forest ranges that you see, several forests as well, that break a lot of the cooler wind that might come from the north. And the river influence is not felt in much of the region. It really is on the Röter Hang, but there's a huge diversity of mesoclimates and soils in this region. And unlike the Mosel or the Rheingau, there's no like single climatic feature. Like even in the Nahe, we have like the river still a pretty significant climatic feature there. It's not the case here. It's really known for polyculture. There's a lot of other agricultural crops planted in the region as well. Riesling is just barely the most planted grape over Müller-Thurgau, 18 versus 15%. And Dornfelder in this region is the most planted red. So the Rheinterrassen is the best known area. It runs along the Rhine after it turns south below Mainz between Nackenheim and Oppenheim. It is a red hill of clay and weathered red sandstone on the left bank of the Rhine. It sits between these villages near Stein and Nackenheim, and is really traditionally associated with quality. This is where that Riesling, the most expensive wine on the Titanic, came from. It came from the Röter Hang, this place. We do see a wide range of grapes here. There's no really single Rheinhessen style, save for that of Liebfraumilch. Liebfraumilch is Our Lady's Milk, and it likely started as an actual product of the Liebfrau Monastery in Worms in the 18th century. Worms is one of the most southern village that you see along the river in the Rheinhessen. And from the 1950s to 1980s, it became Germany's most famous wine brand in the English-speaking world. This would do a lot to Blue Nun Liebfraumilch, a very familiar looking bottle that you would see in the store. It had the Blue Nun on the label of it. And this was a blend of different grape varieties. So not necessarily that high quality. It had to be a minimum of 70% of Riesling or Müller-Thurgau or Sylvaner or Kerner or a blend of the above. Usually it was based on Müller-Thurgau. It had to have at least 18 grams per liter of residual sugar. You could not label the wine varietally. You didn't know what was actually in any producer's Liebfraumilch from winery to winery. And by the 1970s, most of the grapes in the Rheinhessen were really directed into these Liebfraumilch blends. In the past 20 years, we really see this new spirit of these younger, really quality-minded voices. So producers in the region, similar to like the VDP, created a producer association known as Message in a Bottle that really focused on reinvigorating quality winemaking in the Rheinhessen. Pretty much all of the producers we're going to talk about today do or have belonged to Message in a Bottle at some point. But today, Message in a Bottle is known as the Maxim Herkunft Rheinhessen. You saw those labels when we talked about the Prädikat system that you might see on a bottle of wine. It means maximum provenance Rheinhessen. And the members work within the VDP, the 3-tier VDP section. So you could technically belong to the VDP and to the Message in a Bottle Association because they're kind of like two different things, right? VDP covers all 13 Weinbaugebiete in Germany, and the Message in a Bottle or the Maxim Herkunft, I don't know if I can say it without looking at the label, is only for the producers within the Rheingau that choose to adhere to its standards. So here we have the village of Neerstein. We're going to look at a better map where we can look at the really fantastic vineyards of like Hipping and Pettental, which are quite important. So here we have the village of Neerstein. Olberg, Glock, Hipping, Pettental, and Rothenburg are really the top vineyards that we really think about. The Röter Hang is a 3-mile stretch of this iron-rich slate and clay and sandstone, this sort of substrata of rock that pushed up to the surface. It's known as the Permian Rotlegendes, which is one of the Rheinhessen's oldest soils. Oftentimes you see producers that will sort of refer in Germany to any red soil as the Rotlegendes, but this is not necessarily correct. It should really only be for this slate and sandstone that you see within the area. The most important vineyards are Pettental, southeast facing, gravelly red slate up to 170 meters, about 6.5 hectares. Pettental is also an Ort style. And Ort style is a vineyard that is so famous, you don't have to necessarily list it with the name of the village. So if you were listing it with the village, it should technically on a label say Neersteiner Pettental, but you can just list Pettental. But this is also really confusing because imagine, just like in Burgundy, many of the regions within Germany have vineyards that are named the same, right? There's more than one Sonnener or Sundial vineyard within Germany. There's not only one within the Mosel. So imagine the confusion of Burgundy if you didn't name coyotes. There's several coyotes in Burgundy with the name of the village. So just let that sink in for a moment. You also have Hipping, 3.5 hectare amphitheater, has a higher proportion of clay, a richer, rounder mouthfeel. Rothenburg is nearly a monopole of Grunderloch, which we'll talk about, slopes up to 75% grade directly facing the Rhine. Olberg, the warmest Rheinhessen vineyard, fully south-facing, red clay, 80 to 170 meters. And then south of Bad Kreuznach in the Nahe at the border, it's an area known as Rheinhessen, Switzerland. So this is like Florsheim, Dalsheim. This is where you find Weingut Keller. The vineyards are much, they have this kind of like hilly area. I think this is wrong, sorry, because the Rheinhessen, Switzerland, it's really like kind of wavy and hilly. Herkitz is a partially terraced vineyard on those soils of porphyry, that iron-rich volcanic soil that you see as well. Now, it's not just Riesling in the Rheinhessen, right? We talked about 18% of the production is Riesling, 15% is Müller-Thurgau, but dry Sylvaner is also a regional specialty. There's more planted here than any other region in the world, including Franken, which is also known for Sylvaner. And then Scheurebe is also undergoing a small revival of interest. Scheurebe is a really, really aromatic style of grape. So here you can see this whole area is the Röter Hang. As you're looking, as you're looking north. So standing south, looking north along the Rhine River, and this is the Röter Hang. You can see this big site of these different vineyards on the red soils here. This picture actually came from the VDP website. So who are the producers we're thinking about? We have Weingut Grunderloch, located in Nackenheim. Karl Grunderloch was a banker. He purchased the Rothenburg vineyard almost in its entirety in 1890 because he would drive from his home in Gundersblum to the bank that he worked at in Mainz. And he noticed as he was driving that the best sun exposure on his route was in this vineyard in Rothenburg. And so today, Johannes is the winemaker. He oversees the winery, and he said that his great-great-grandfather, Karl, became bored with finance when he was around 70 years old and started in the wine business. They're just in the heart of the Nackenheim village. 85% of what they produce is Riesling. They also do Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris. But you'll also see, actually, no, sorry, I'm thinking about Keller. Pinot Blanc and Pinot Gris. The wines all go through a cold soak, so you see a little bit more texture coming from the skins here. You don't gain any color like an orange wine because you're not really like macerating or fermenting the skins with the juice. It's just a short cold soak before the fermentation begins. Single vineyard wines age on the lees in barrel until they're needed for the next vintage. Single vineyard wines are aged in 70% neutral oak, with plans for 100% in the future. They make several regional wines, Rheinhessen style wines, Riesling, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, Sauvignon Blanc. They do make another one, I knew it. They also make Sylvaner, coming as an Ortswein from the village. Eindruck von Mir is a style of Riesling that tends to be more creamy. They leave it on the full leans, full on the lees. The Rotem Schiefer comes from red slate from 3 different sites that are blended together. They also have Earthlage. The village wines come from the Earthlage, Nierstein and Nackenheim. They're Großgewachs, Hipping, Pettental, and Rothenburg as well. And they also make Prodicot wine from Rothenburg. Their most well-known wine is this one here, which is the Jean Baptiste Cabernet. Weingut Keller, also incredibly important. So they're located a little bit further inland. They're not directly on the river like a lot of the other sites we talk about. So they're located in Florsheim, Dalsheim. So this was that kind of Rheinhessen, Switzerland, as we mentioned before. Johann Keller immigrated from Switzerland to Dalsheim in 1790 and purchased the 4-hectare parcel in the Hubacher site. Today it's run by Klaus and his son Klaus Peter. And the next generation, Felix, is also becoming involved. This is a picture from, I'd say, the early to mid 2000s. So the sons are much older than they are in this picture here. The winery is in the Hugerland, the hilly land, further west, as I mentioned, in the best known area of the Röter Hang. They have vineyards are really dispersed. So Kirchspiel, Moorstein, Westhofen in the south, Hipping and Pettental in Nierstein in the north. And they also own a plot of own-rooted Riesling in the Skubersley vineyard in Peaceport in the Mosel, where Julia is actually from the Mosel, his wife that you see here. And he's really been the one, Klaus really began to elevate the reputation of the Hugerland by mapping out his vineyards. They also began planting better clones mapped to each terroir. And Julia had a lot to do with this too, because she really insisted that they bring a lot of the Riesling clones that her family grew within the Mosel and planted them in the Rheinhessen, which were of much higher quality as well. Klaus Peter studied at Geisenheim. He worked in Burgundy before he came back. His entry-level wine ferment in stainless steel, higher level wine than large wood. 70% of their plots are classified as Grosslagen, and 20% of their production is Großgewach. So they make Riesling in Moorstein, Kirchspiel, and Hubacher. Their dry wines are divided into several ranges. So you'll see the different areas. So the Riesling von der Fels from the Rock, the youngest vine in the Großlage. The S varietals come from old vines of each variety. And then you have the G-Max Riesling is from the oldest vine in an unnamed Großlage. And the current vintages sell for $1,000 per bottle. It just said literally G-Max. It's named for G, I think it's for one of his grandfather, one of his family members, and I think Max is one of his sons, Maxime or Maximus maybe. They also produce off-dry and Prodicot styles of wine. They also produce things like Sylvaner as well, and they have a white label range that's for more of their entry level, sort of like Kalkstein. Sometimes they label the wines by soil type, but you'll see not only these yellow labels, but they also have a range of white labels as well that tend to be the more entry levels. They also produce Pinot Noir, Spätburgunder, coming from limestone soils. This is Caroline and her husband, Caroline Gillot. They're based in Bodenheim in the Rheinhessen. The estate dates back to over 200 years, but it took its current name between the marriage of Caroline and Oliver. She also graduated from Geisenheim. She trained at Comte Lafon before taking over the family winery. The winery itself runs in tandem with her husband's winery, which is the Battenfield Spaniard, which is established in 1993. These vineyards come from a little bit further south near Worms in the vineyards of the Battenfield Spaniard, further south from Worms in the Rheinhessen. The vineyards are located in more than a dozen spots along the Rhine to Hessen. It's a stretch of red slate between Nackenheim and Oppenheim. Riesling is under half a planting, Pinot Noir the next most important. You have the Ortswein, you have Grosslagen, Hipping, Pettental. You already know all of these ones. Olberg we talked about as well. Olberg is that warmer, richer, south-facing site, remember? They make 4 different Grosser Gewachs from adjacent vineyards on the Röter Hang, Pettental, Hipping, Olberg, and Rothenburg again. The Rothenburg is a verse select, which is, I believe, ungrafted old vines within the area. All of their Grossgewachs Rieslings stay on the lees until just before bottling. And they do a lot of kind of fun things. The treasure selection, the late releases, bottled 1 year after release, but stored for 4 years on the property. And they really believe they should be drunk at 5 years when they're released. So they carry the date released from the cellar on the label as well. Their style focuses on the richness and the softness of the Rheinhessen. They don't tend to use any botrytis in the dry style wine, which is the majority of what the estate makes. You'll see a lot of their Grossgewach wines as well. Sometimes they will make Cabernet, Spätlese, or Auslese if the weather does allow it. We've only got a few left. I'm sorry I'm keeping everybody so long tonight. There's so much to cover with all of these producers, but we've only got a few left. And then I'll send out the slides, so you'll also have all the vintages that we have at the end too. So located in Sierfersheim, also in the Rheinhessen, founded in 1845, managed since 92 by Daniel Wagner, the 9th generation. I think Klaus Peter Keller, who we were just talking about, is the 8th generation of his family's estate. Daniel worked in Tuscany, Bordeaux, Napa, the driving force behind the move, the quality of his estate. Previous generations of his family produced primarily bulk wine from their vineyards. The vineyards are divided into about 20 parcels. The majority of them are less than a hectare, and they're primarily focused on Riesling. More than half of plantings are Riesling, followed by Pinot Blanc. You see that a lot, right? Pinot Blanc, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Blanc. Riesling is planted with southern exposures on the best stony ground. Pinot Noir is planted where you see more sand and loam, and nearly all of their production is dry as well. Weingut Wittmann, this is one of my favorites. I really I'm never disappointed by these wines. They also have another label color that's kind of more like a yellow. It looks exactly the same, the stripes, but it's like yellow and tan stripes instead of like the dark blue and light blue. It's like light yellow, dark yellow, or like light tan, light yellow, dark tan, light tan. And the tan or yellowish labels are for other grape varieties. So like also for their, Pinot Blanc, for example. What do we call Pinot Blanc in Germany and Pinot Gris? Anyone? So the family has been growing grapes in Westhoffen since 1663. Philip is married to Eva Kluserath of the Mosel Engser Kluserath as well. Westhoffen is in the northern Rheinhessen. There's a lot more limestone in this area. They're really top sites for both Riesling and for Pinot Noir. 75% of their production is Riesling with Pinot Noir, Chardonnay. They also make Weißburgunder, which is Pinot Blanc, which I just asked, right? And then Grauburgunder, which is Pinot Gris. Primarily a focus on dry styles of wine, but they will produce sweet styles without botrytis influence if the vintage does permit it. All the whites are aged in large oak at the estate. They all stay on the full lees until February or March. The Erstlage and Grosslage are racked from the full lees to the fine lees. They spend 2 to 3 months after that in stainless steel. So these are wines of texture and some richness and some intensity as well. They're really purposefully made. They also make Sylvaner, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, Pinot Noir, as we mentioned. They have the Erstlage in Westhoffen and Nierstein, the Premier Cru, and they make Grossgewachs and Kirchspiel, Brunenhausen, Moorstein, and Aulerede, which I don't know that one as well. So the vintages I'll just send for you here. I think the most important thing I'll say is that, whenever you see the vintage ratings for Germany, it's almost always based on sweet wines. So the assessments have really been dependent of the vintage quality if you could produce these really lusciously sweet wines, which are typically less than 1% of the production. So what this has really done in the past is put an emphasis on the end of the season. That's when we really begin to see how the quality will turn out for the Auslese level and above, Auslese, Birnauslese, Trockenbirnauslese. You won't know about ice vine until late in the season. We're making very, very little ice vine these days because the weather just doesn't allow it. And I haven't even seen a Schneewein, which is an ice vine made when picked when there's snow on the ground for ever. I've never seen one, but apparently there's Schneewein. Ice vine is picked when there's snow on the ground. So this transition to predominantly dry wines put the emphasis more on the growing season as a whole, as opposed to that end of the season time when we can really think about the focus of the sweet wine. A golden October harvest allows grapes to first be harvested for dry wine and then allowed botrytis to develop for dessert wine. That would be the optimal result for a lot of producers. And we've really seen a record number of top vintages in the past decade. We have producers that say today, it used to be that you would have maybe 2 really good vintages in a decade. You would have like 4 kind of moderate vintages in a decade, and you would have like 3 or 4 not great in a decade. But really, as you can see here, so the bold are for good vintages. 2014, 2013, not great. A lot of rain, a lot of rot, a lot of the spotted wing Drosophila that year. I actually worked harvest in 2014 in the Rheingau, and I can tell you it was not pretty sometimes. 2008, 2006, not great, but really we're seeing with global warming a really much better climate for ripening these grapes and producing these styles of wine. Sorry guys, I didn't mean to keep you all night, so I'll just let you jump off of here. I'll send out the recording tomorrow. If you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to let me know. If you didn't catch up on the Rheingau or the Mosel recording, I can get that out to you as well. And I hope that you'll join Ryan next week as well for our last series in the Spotlight, which will take place discussing the Pfalz-Baden and some of the other kind of smaller regions of Germany as well. Have a great night, everyone. See you soon.